December 20th, 1941. The sky above Kunming, China, carried the mechanical drone of Japanese bomber engines as they approached in their customary formation. For months, these raids had proceeded with brutal predictability. The bombers would arrive, release their ordnance, and depart largely unmolested. Chinese defenses had proven inadequate against the relentless aerial assault that sought to sever the Burma Road, China's last remaining supply line to the outside world. But on this particular morning, something was different. As the Japanese formation crossed into Chinese airspace, they suddenly found themselves intercepted by aircraft they had not encountered before. Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, bearing Chinese insignia but flown by American pilots, dove into the bomber formation with aggressive purpose. The engagement was brief and violent. 4 Japanese bombers fell from the sky. The surviving raiders, disrupted and shaken, dropped their bombs short of their intended targets and fled toward their bases in Indochina. Several of the retreating bombers would not complete the journey home. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. For the Japanese pilots who survived that encounter, the experience proved profoundly disorienting. They had engaged these new American fighters with the tactics that had served them so effectively against Chinese aircraft. They had maneuvered, turned, pursued. Some had scored hits, solid hits, the kind of hits that should have ended the engagement decisively. Yet the American aircraft had not fallen from the sky as expected. Pilots returned to their bases reporting a troubling phenomenon. They had struck enemy fighters with cannon fire and machine gun rounds. They had observed their ammunition finding its mark, had seen the distinctive flash of impacts against metal airframes. But the enemy aircraft had not disintegrated, had not caught fire, had not spun out of control toward the ground below. Instead, these American fighters had simply continued flying. They had maintained their attacks, completed their maneuvers, and in many cases, successfully returned to their bases despite sustaining battle damage that should have proven catastrophic. This was not how aerial combat was supposed to proceed according to Japanese tactical doctrine and combat experience. The American Volunteer Group, soon to become famous as the Flying Tigers, had just introduced Japanese Army and Naval Air Forces to an uncomfortable reality about American aircraft design philosophy. The P-40 Warhawk represented a fundamentally different approach to fighter aircraft construction, one that prioritized pilot survival and aircraft durability over the absolute optimization of performance characteristics. The question that would haunt Japanese pilots throughout the coming months of combat was deceptively simple: how could American fighters absorb such punishment and continue fighting? The answer lay not in superior maneuverability, not in overwhelming speed, not in devastating firepower. The answer resided in thousands of carefully calculated decisions made by American engineers at drawing boards in Buffalo, New York, engineers who had designed their fighter aircraft under the assumption that their pilots would be hit in combat and needed to survive the experience. Japanese aircraft designers had made very different calculations, operating under very different assumptions about what made a superior fighter aircraft. These divergent engineering philosophies, rooted in profoundly different cultural attitudes toward combat, survival, and acceptable risk, would play out across thousands of individual engagements throughout the Pacific War. The story of how Japanese pilots came to understand American aircraft durability is a story about the collision of incompatible design philosophies and the brutal education that combat provides to those whose assumptions prove incorrect. To understand Japanese pilots' shock at American aircraft survivability, one must first understand the philosophy that governed Japanese fighter design in the years leading to the Pacific War. This philosophy did not emerge arbitrarily. It reflected carefully considered engineering choices, tactical requirements, operational constraints, and cultural values deeply embedded in Japanese military thinking. Japanese fighter aircraft development in the 1930s proceeded under severe material constraints that shaped every design decision. Japan lacked the abundant natural resources available to the United States. High-grade aluminum alloys, specialty steels, and strategic materials required for aircraft construction existed in limited quantities. Japanese industry could not match American production capacity or material abundance. These fundamental limitations forced Japanese designers to maximize performance through minimal weight rather than through overwhelming power or robust construction. The result was aircraft that achieved remarkable capabilities through radical weight reduction. The Mitsubishi Is-6M0, which would become the most famous Japanese fighter of the war, exemplified this design philosophy perfectly. The Zero's design deliberately sacrificed structural strength and safety for performance, with no armor protection for the pilot and no self-sealing fuel tanks, because armor protection was considered anathema to the samurai warrior tradition. The rise and fall of the Japanese Zero warfare history network. The aircraft utilized advanced lightweight aluminum alloys and achieved exceptional maneuverability through extremely low wing loading. At low speeds, the Zero could turn inside virtually any Allied fighter in service during the war's early years. This extraordinary agility came at a calculated cost that Japanese designers accepted willingly. Japanese military doctrine emphasized the decisive importance of superior pilot skill and fighting spirit. The prevailing tactical philosophy held that the better pilot, flying the more maneuverable aircraft, would win aerial engagements through superior technique rather than through aircraft durability. If a pilot allowed himself to be hit repeatedly, this represented failure in the fundamental art of aerial combat. The skilled pilot would not be hit at all, or would receive only glancing damage before destroying his opponent through precisely executed maneuvers. This doctrine aligned with broader Japanese military culture that valued offensive spirit and individual warrior prowess. A pilot was considered expendable as long as he fulfilled his sacred duty for the emperor. The rise and fall of the Japanese Zero warfare history network. Armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks were deliberately omitted in favor of lighter weight and greater range. The philosophy held that these defensive measures represented unnecessary weight that degraded the performance characteristics that truly mattered in combat. Japanese pilots trained extensively in aerobatic maneuverability and close-in dogfighting techniques. They practiced tight turns, precise control at low speeds, and the complex coordination required to maintain formation integrity while executing rapid tactical changes. Training emphasized developing pilots who could extract maximum performance from highly responsive, lightweight aircraft through superior skill and aggressive tactics. The Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, used extensively by the Japanese Army Air Force, embodied similar design priorities. The aircraft possessed exceptional maneuverability but had notable weaknesses, including limited firepower and insufficient armor protection for the pilot. Japanese aircraft, World War II. Japanese designers understood these limitations but considered them acceptable trade-offs for the tactical advantages gained through superior agility and lighter weight. Early combat experience seemed to validate Japanese design philosophy completely. In China, Japanese fighters dominated Chinese aircraft through superior maneuverability and better trained pilots. In the opening months of the Pacific War, Japanese naval and Army air forces achieved stunning victories against Allied forces throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific. British, Dutch, and American aircraft fell before Japanese fighters whose agility and experienced pilots proved devastatingly effective. These early victories reinforced Japanese confidence in their design approach and tactical doctrine. The assumptions underlying their aircraft development seemed confirmed by combat results that exceeded even optimistic Japanese projections. American fighter aircraft development proceeded from fundamentally different premises, shaped by different material realities, different tactical requirements, and different cultural attitudes toward acceptable combat losses. The P-40 reflected an American design philosophy that called for heavily armed, rugged, fast fighter aircraft with self-sealing fuel tanks and armor for the pilot. The Pacific War Online Encyclopedia, P-40 Warhawk, U.S. fighter. These were not afterthoughts or luxury additions. They represented core design requirements that American engineers incorporated from the earliest stages of development. The United States possessed overwhelming advantages in industrial capacity and access to strategic materials that Japanese designers could only envy. American factories could produce aircraft in quantities that dwarfed Japanese output. More importantly, American industry had access to high-grade aluminum alloys, specialized steels, and other materials in quantities sufficient to support robust construction without compromising production volume. This material abundance allowed American designers to accept higher empty weights in exchange for characteristics that enhanced pilot survival. American military culture, shaped by different historical experiences and cultural values, approached the question of pilot survivability very differently than their Japanese counterparts. American commanders recognized that trained pilots represented irreplaceable assets whose loss degraded combat effectiveness more severely than aircraft losses. An experienced pilot who survived being shot down could return to combat in a replacement aircraft. A dead pilot, regardless of how courageously he had fought, could not contribute to subsequent operations and required replacement by a less experienced aviator. This calculation led American designers to prioritize survivability features even when these features added weight and complexity to aircraft design. The P-40B introduced armor behind the pilot, an armored windscreen, and partially protected fuel tanks. Pilot armor and self-sealing tanks were added at significant cost and speed and climb rate. Fandom Pacific War Online Encyclopedia. American designers accepted these performance penalties as worthwhile exchanges for improved pilot survival rates. The armor plate mounted behind the pilot's seat could stop rifle-caliber rounds and provide protection against shell fragments. The armored windscreen offered frontal protection during head-on attacks. Self-sealing fuel tanks, constructed with multiple layers including rubber compounds that swelled when exposed to fuel, could seal bullet holes and prevent catastrophic fuel loss. These features added hundreds of pounds to aircraft empty weight. They reduced maximum speed, degraded climb rate, and decreased overall agility compared to what the same airframe could achieve without protective features. American designers judged these trade-offs acceptable because they fundamentally changed pilot survival probability during combat damage. The Curtiss P-40 development reflected this design philosophy throughout its evolution. The first production P-40 aircraft delivered in early 1940 lacked armor or self-sealing fuel tanks and was relatively lightly armed. However, this model proved inadequate for combat requirements. The Pacific War Online Encyclopedia. P-40 Warhawk, U.S. fighter. Subsequent variants progressively incorporated more comprehensive protection as combat experience validated the importance of survivability features. By the time P-40B and C models entered service, they carried substantial armor protection and fully self-sealing fuel systems despite the performance costs these additions imposed. American tactical doctrine evolved to exploit these survivability advantages. Rather than emphasizing close-in turning dogfights where agility mattered most, American doctrine stressed hit-and-run tactics, diving attacks from altitude, and disengagement when circumstances proved unfavorable. These tactics assumed pilots would sometimes be hit and needed aircraft capable of absorbing damage while still remaining controllable enough to return to base. The P-40's structural strength complemented its protective features. The airframe was substantially built with generous safety margins engineered into critical structural components. This robust construction philosophy contrasted with Japanese approaches that minimized structure to absolute limits. American aircraft could sustain significant battle damage to non-critical structures and maintain flight integrity, while equivalent damage often proved catastrophic to more lightly built Japanese fighters. When the American Volunteer Group began operations in China and Burma with their P-40B Tomahawks in late 1941, they brought with them aircraft embodying this comprehensive survivability philosophy. Japanese pilots were about to receive an expensive education in why American designers had made the choices they did. The American Volunteer Group that began operations in late 1941 consisted of precisely 99 operational Curtiss P-40B Tomahawk fighters assembled at Taungoo, Burma. The aircraft came from a Curtiss assembly line producing Tomahawk IIB models originally intended for the Royal Air Force in North Africa, though evidence suggests Curtiss used leftover components making them closer to the older P-40B specification Flying Tigers. Wikipedia. Each aircraft weighed approximately 8,300 pounds empty, climbing to over 10,000 pounds when fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and pilot. Behind each pilot's seat sat a quarter-inch steel armor plate, positioned to protect the pilot's back and head from rear attacks. The windscreen incorporated armored glass capable of stopping rifle-caliber rounds. The fuel tanks featured external self-sealing coatings that would swell and seal punctures when exposed to leaking fuel. These features distinguished the aircraft from earlier P-40 models that lacked armor plate or self-sealing tanks. Flying Tigers Wikipedia, though the external coating system proved less effective than the internal membrane systems fitted to later variants. The structural airframe itself represented substantial engineering. Wing spars were built with generous safety factors. The fuselage utilized heavy stringers and formers that provided exceptional rigidity. Control surfaces were robustly constructed with multiple attach points distributing load stresses. This construction added weight but created an aircraft that could absorb significant structural damage without experiencing catastrophic failure. Claire Chennault, the former United States Army Air Corps officer commanding the AVG, understood his aircraft's characteristics intimately. He had studied the P-40's performance envelope exhaustively and recognized both its strengths and limitations. Chennault knew his fighters could not match Japanese aircraft in sustained turning engagements at low speeds. The heavier American fighters, burdened by their protective features and robust construction, simply could not turn as tightly as the lightweight Zeros and Hayabusas they would face. But Chennault also recognized advantages his pilots could exploit. The P-40 had a higher dive speed than any Japanese fighter aircraft of the early war years and could exploit boom and zoom tactics. Curtis P-40 Warhawk Wikipedia. The aircraft could dive faster, accelerate more quickly in level flight, and most critically, could absorb battle damage that would destroy Japanese fighters. Chennault developed tactical doctrines specifically designed to maximize these strengths while avoiding circumstances where Japanese maneuverability advantages would prove decisive. His pilots received explicit instructions: never attempt sustained turning dogfights with Japanese fighters. Always maintain speed advantage. Attack from altitude using diving passes. If hit or outnumbered, dive away at maximum speed and use the P-40's superior diving capability to disengage. The tactics assumed pilots would sometimes be hit and needed to survive the encounter to fight again. The Japanese pilots who would face these American fighters operated under very different tactical frameworks. Their aircraft, whether Navy Zeros or Army Hayabusas and Nakajima Ki-44 fighters, weighed substantially less than the P-40s. A fully loaded Zero weighed approximately 5,800 pounds, nearly 2,000 pounds lighter than a comparable P-40. This weight advantage translated directly into superior maneuverability at lower speeds. Japanese pilots trained to exploit this agility through classic dogfighting techniques. They would engage enemy aircraft, force turning contests, and use superior maneuverability to achieve favorable firing positions. Their aircraft responded crisply to control inputs and could execute tight turns that American fighters could not match. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized aggressive engagement and decisive destruction of enemy aircraft through superior maneuvering skill. The lightweight construction that enabled this agility came with vulnerabilities Japanese pilots understood but accepted as necessary trade-offs. Their aircraft lacked armor protection. Fuel tanks had no self-sealing capability. Structural strength was minimized to reduce weight. A few well-placed hits from heavy machine gun fire could prove catastrophic, but Japanese doctrine held that superior pilots would not allow themselves to be hit repeatedly. When these divergent tactical philosophies and aircraft designs first collided in combat over China and Burma in late 1941, Japanese pilots received their first indication that something about the American fighters did not conform to their expectations. The P-40s did not maneuver as Japanese fighters did. American pilots refused to engage in the turning dogfights where Japanese advantages would prove decisive. Instead, they attacked from altitude, struck with heavy firepower, and dove away before Japanese pilots could bring their maneuverability advantages to bear. More troubling still, when Japanese pilots did manage to score hits on the American fighters, the expected results often failed to materialize. Aircraft that should have fallen from the sky continued flying. Pilots who should have died remained in their cockpits, controlling damaged aircraft back toward their bases. The Americans were fighting according to rules Japanese tactical doctrine had not anticipated. On August 29, 1941, Australian pilot Clive Caldwell flying a P-40C Tomahawk was engaged by two German Bf-109 fighters over North Africa, including one piloted by Ace Werner Schroer. Caldwell shot down Schroer and forced him to disengage after heavily damaging his fighter, then made it safely back to base with damage from over 107.9mm bullets and 520mm cannon shells. P-40 Warhawk fighter, World War II database. This engagement exemplified a pattern that would repeat itself thousands of times across multiple theaters of war. The P-40 had absorbed what should have been catastrophic damage yet remained controllable and brought its pilot home alive. Japanese pilots encountered this same phenomenon repeatedly during their early engagements with AVG P-40s over China and Burma. Combat reports filed by Japanese aircrews throughout late 1941 and early 1942 documented a consistent and troubling pattern. Pilots reported scoring hits on American fighters, observing their rounds striking enemy aircraft, yet failing to achieve the decisive kills they expected. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. One Japanese pilot, flying a Nakajima Ki-43 in an engagement over Rangoon, reported in his after-action account that he had successfully maneuvered onto an American fighter's tail and fired multiple sustained bursts at close range. He observed his rounds impacting the enemy aircraft's fuselage and wings. Under normal circumstances, such concentrated fire would have resulted in either immediate destruction or forced the enemy pilot to bail out of his crippled aircraft. Instead, the American fighter simply rolled into a steep dive and accelerated away at a speed the lighter Japanese fighter could not match. The American pilot escaped, presumably returning to base in his damaged but still flyable aircraft. The Japanese pilot's report conveyed genuine puzzlement at this outcome that contradicted his training and combat experience. Multiple similar reports accumulated from different units, different pilots, different engagements. The pattern proved impossible to ignore or dismiss as isolated incidents. American P-40 fighters were routinely surviving damage levels that would have destroyed Japanese aircraft. Moreover, American pilots were returning to combat in subsequent days, flying replacement aircraft or the same aircraft after field repairs, demonstrating that the damage sustained had not even permanently removed these fighters from operational service. Japanese intelligence officers began collecting and analyzing these combat reports systematically. The accumulating evidence forced recognition of an uncomfortable reality. American fighters possessed survivability characteristics that Japanese aircraft completely lacked. This survivability advantage was not marginal or situational. It represented a fundamental difference in design philosophy that conferred substantial tactical advantages to American pilots. The material evidence became even more direct when Japanese forces began recovering wrecked P-40 aircraft from crash sites. Technical intelligence teams examined these wrecks carefully, documenting construction techniques and protective features. They discovered the armor plate behind pilot seats, sometimes bearing impact marks from bullets that had been stopped before reaching the pilot. They examined self-sealing fuel tanks that had successfully prevented catastrophic fuel loss despite multiple punctures. They noted the robust structural construction that allowed airframes to maintain integrity despite severe battle damage. Japanese engineers conducting these examinations understood immediately the implications of what they were observing. American designers had invested substantial weight allowances into survivability features that Japanese designers had deliberately omitted. These features worked as intended, protecting pilots and enabling damaged aircraft to return to base. The weight penalties were real and measurable, but the survivability advantages proved tactically decisive in ways that transcended simple performance comparisons. Technical air intelligence units were formed by Allied forces to recover and test Japanese aircraft, and reciprocally, Japanese forces conducted similar evaluations of captured Allied aircraft. Technical Air Intelligence Unit Wikipedia. When Japanese technical teams had opportunities to examine intact or reparable P-40 aircraft, they conducted systematic assessments of construction quality, material specifications, and design features. These technical evaluations confirmed what combat reports had already suggested. American aircraft were substantially built with generous safety margins throughout their structures. The armor protection, while adding considerable weight, provided genuine protection against common caliber weapons. The The self-sealing fuel tanks, though not perfect, significantly reduced fire risk from fuel system damage. Every aspect of the design reflected an engineering philosophy that prioritized pilot survival even at substantial performance cost. Japanese pilots who flew captured P-40 aircraft in evaluation flights reported experiences that challenged their fundamental assumptions about fighter aircraft characteristics. The American fighters felt heavy and less responsive than Japanese types. They could not turn as tightly or maintain the same angles of attack during maneuvering. Yet they possessed a solidity and sense of protection that Japanese fighters completely lacked. The heavy controls required more physical effort but provided precise feedback and remained effective across wider speed ranges. The divergent design philosophies created measurably different survival rates for pilots flying comparable missions in different aircraft types. Japanese fighter pilots faced increasing attrition rates as the war progressed, with experienced aviators being killed or severely wounded at rates that proved unsustainable. Each lost pilot took with him years of training and combat experience that could not be quickly replaced. New pilots arrived at operational units with minimal flight hours and often survived only a handful of missions before being shot down. The attrition spiral that devastated Japanese pilot cadres stemmed partly from tactical circumstances and partly from aircraft design choices. When Japanese fighters were hit in combat, the lack of armor protection meant pilots faced direct exposure to enemy fire. The absence of self-sealing fuel tanks meant that fuel system damage frequently resulted in fires that gave pilots only seconds to escape before flames filled their cockpits. The lightweight structural construction meant that airframe damage often proved immediately catastrophic rather than degrading performance gradually. American pilots flying P-40s faced the same combat hazards but with substantially different outcomes. When hit, the armor plate behind their seats stopped or deflected rounds that would have killed or incapacitated Japanese pilots. When fuel tanks were punctured, the self-sealing systems prevented or limited fuel loss, often allowing pilots to continue flying rather than bailing out immediately. When airframes sustained damage, the robust construction frequently allowed continued controlled flight back to friendly territory. The aggregate effect of these individual survival advantages accumulated across thousands of combat engagements. American pilots who survived being shot down or made emergency landings could return to combat operations. Their combat experience remained available to their units and could be passed to newer pilots through training and mentorship. Unit combat effectiveness remained higher because experienced pilots survived longer and inexperienced pilots received better training from veterans who had survived extended combat tours. Japanese units experienced the opposite dynamic. Experienced pilots died at higher rates due to reduced survivability. Their accumulated combat knowledge died with them. Replacement pilots arrived with inadequate training due to fuel shortages that limited flight hours. These inexperienced pilots, lacking proper training and veteran mentorship, died at even higher rates than their predecessors. The negative feedback loop accelerated as the war progressed. In just 6.5 months of operations, the Flying Tigers destroyed 297 enemy aircraft for the loss of just 4 of their own in air-to-air combat, though nearly a quarter of their pilots were killed, captured, or missing in action. Curtis P-40 Warhawk, Wikipedia. Even when AVG pilots were shot down, many survived the experience and returned to operations, their survival enabled partly by the protective features built into their aircraft. Japanese commanders recognized the problem but faced severe constraints preventing effective response. Material shortages made it impossible to add protective features to existing aircraft designs without completely redesigning production processes. The lightweight construction techniques that enabled Japanese fighter performance could not simply incorporate armor plate and self-sealing tanks without fundamentally compromising the characteristics that made these aircraft competitive. Any attempt to add protective weight would degrade the maneuverability advantages that represented Japanese fighters' primary tactical strength. Later Japanese designs attempted to address these survivability deficiencies. The Nakajima Ki-84 offered pilots better protection than unsealed wing tanks and light alloy airframe of the Ki-43, utilizing 65mm armor glass canopy, 13mm of head and back armor, and multiple bulkheads protecting both the methanol water tank and centrally located fuel tank. Nakajima Ki-84 Wikipedia. However, these improved designs arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to reverse the attrition trends already devastating Japanese pilot cadres. The philosophical collision between American survivability-focused design and Japanese performance-focused design played out across statistical realities that could not be argued with or dismissed. American pilots survived combat tours at higher rates. American units maintained combat effectiveness longer despite equivalent exposure to combat. American training programs could rely on combat veterans returning to train new pilots. Japanese forces experienced accelerating degradation in pilot quality as attrition outpaced training capacity. The P-40, despite its limitations in pure performance metrics, proved devastatingly effective in sustained combat operations precisely because its design prioritized keeping pilots alive. Japanese fighters, despite their superior maneuverability, could not overcome the fundamental disadvantage of killing their pilots at unsustainable rates. Engineering philosophy had proven as decisive as tactical skill or raw performance capability. By mid-1942, Japanese tactical doctrine began incorporating explicit acknowledgement of American aircraft survivability advantages. Training materials and operational briefings instructed pilots on the necessity of achieving decisive kills rather than assuming that scoring hits would prove sufficient. Japanese pilots received guidance emphasizing concentration of fire, targeting critical aircraft components, and pressing attacks to closer ranges where heavier caliber weapons could penetrate armor protection and overwhelm self-sealing systems. These tactical adjustments represented recognition of reality but could not overcome the fundamental disadvantage inherent in Japanese aircraft design. Japanese fighters still lacked the protective features that kept American pilots alive. Japanese pilots still faced immediate mortal danger when hit, while their American opponents enjoyed margins of survivability that translated directly into higher survival rates across extended combat operations. The American Volunteer Group disbanded officially on July 4, 1942, though its legacy in tactical lessons continued through its successor organization. The Flying Tigers were integrated into the USAF as the 23rd Fighter Group in June 1942, and the unit continued to fly newer model P-40s until 1944, achieving a high kill-to-loss ratio. Curtis P-40 Warhawk Wikipedia. The tactical doctrine Chenault had developed, exploiting P-40 survivability advantages while avoiding circumstances where Japanese maneuverability would prove decisive, became standard practice for American fighter units throughout the Pacific Theater. Units arriving in the China-Burma-India theater after the AVG in the 10th and 14th Air Forces continued to perform well with the P-40, claiming 973 kills in the theater, representing 64.8% of all enemy aircraft shot down. Curtis P-40 Warhawk Wikipedia. These impressive statistics reflected not just pilot skill or tactical proficiency but the cumulative advantage of flying aircraft designed to bring pilots home alive even after sustaining battle damage. Japanese aircraft development programs attempted to address survivability deficiencies in later war designs, but material shortages and production constraints limited the effectiveness of these efforts. Adding armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks to existing designs proved impossible without completely compromising the performance characteristics that made Japanese fighters competitive. Developing entirely new designs incorporating protective features required time and resources that Japan's deteriorating strategic situation increasingly denied. The few advanced Japanese fighters that did incorporate improved protection arrived too late and in numbers too small to affect strategic outcomes. The Ki-84 He-8 is generally considered the best Japanese fighter to operate in large numbers during the conflict, with performance that matched any single-engine Allied fighter it faced. Nakajima Ki-84 Wikipedia. However, production numbers remained insufficient and quality control problems stemming from material shortages and dispersed manufacturing degraded operational effectiveness. Meanwhile, American fighter development continued incorporating and improving survivability features as standard design requirements. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt took survivability to new extremes, incorporating even more extensive armor protection and demonstrating legendary ability to absorb catastrophic battle damage while bringing pilots home. The North American P-51 Mustang, while somewhat less heavily armored than the P-47, still incorporated comprehensive protective features as baseline design elements. American pilots flying these aircraft enjoyed survivability advantages that compounded throughout their combat careers. A pilot who survived being shot down early in his tour, protected by armor plate that stopped rounds that would have killed him, gained experience that made him more effective in subsequent engagements. That increased effectiveness improved his survival probability in future combat, creating positive feedback loops that enhanced unit combat effectiveness over time. Japanese pilots experienced the opposite trajectory. Those who survived early combat encounters did so despite their aircraft's vulnerability rather than because of protective design features. As combat exposure accumulated, probability caught up with even the most skilled pilots. Without protective features to provide margins of survivability, Japanese pilots faced binary outcomes when hit. Either the damage proved insufficient to down the aircraft immediately, or it proved catastrophic and fatal. There existed no middle ground where a pilot might be hit seriously but survive due to armor protection or self-sealing tanks preventing fire. The statistical outcomes of these divergent design philosophies became impossible to ignore by late 1943. Japanese fighter pilot attrition rates reached levels that training programs could not sustain. American fighter pilot survival rates, while certainly not immune to combat losses, remained manageable within the capacity of training infrastructure to replace losses with adequately prepared pilots. The human cost of Japanese design philosophy manifested most clearly in the experiences of individual pilots who understood perfectly well the vulnerabilities they faced every time they climbed into their cockpits. Japanese fighter pilots were not ignorant of their aircraft's lack of protection. They understood that they flew without armor plate, without self-sealing fuel tanks, without the safety margins American pilots enjoyed. This knowledge shaped their psychological experience of combat in ways that compounded the physical dangers they faced. Every mission carried the awareness that a single unlucky hit could prove immediately fatal in ways that equivalent hits might not kill American pilots. Japanese pilots could not rely on armor protection to stop rounds targeting their backs during tail attacks. They could not trust self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent fires when fuel systems were punctured. They could not depend on robust airframe construction to maintain control authority after sustaining structural damage. Each combat engagement represented existential risk in its most unforgiving form. This psychological burden accumulated across combat tours that, for the lucky or skilled, might extend across multiple months. The stress of flying repeated missions without protective margins that American pilots took for granted contributed to fatigue, degraded decision-making, and ultimately reduced combat effectiveness. Pilots who survived multiple close calls understood with increasing certainty that probability would eventually catch them, that no amount of skill could indefinitely compensate for the fundamental vulnerability of their aircraft. American pilots flying P-40s experienced combat stress and fear as universal constants of aerial warfare, but they flew with knowledge that their aircraft incorporated features specifically designed to keep them alive when hit. The armor plate behind their seats represented tangible, physical protection they could touch and see. The self-sealing fuel tanks, though invisible during normal operations, provided reassurance that fuel system damage would not automatically result in catastrophic fire. The robust airframe construction meant that even severe damage might allow controlled flight back to friendly territory. These protective features did not eliminate danger or guarantee survival, but they fundamentally changed the probability distribution of outcomes when aircraft sustained battle damage. American pilots who were hit had genuine chances of survival that Japanese pilots in equivalent circumstances did not possess. This difference in survivability translated directly into different psychological experiences of combat and different trajectories of combat effectiveness over extended operational periods. The families of Japanese pilots killed in combat bore the ultimate cost of design philosophy decisions made years before in engineering offices and military procurement meetings. Each pilot death represented not just individual tragedy but the loss of trained, experienced aviators whose skills and knowledge died with them. The aggregate effect across thousands of individual deaths fundamentally weakened Japanese air combat capability in ways that could not be compensated through tactical adjustments or improved training programs. Japanese commanders understood these dynamics but faced impossible choices. Redesigning aircraft to incorporate protective features would require halting production of existing types, retooling manufacturing facilities, and accepting severe disruptions to aircraft availability during transition periods. Japan's deteriorating strategic situation made such disruptions unacceptable. Commanders had to continue operating with existing aircraft types despite knowing their survivability deficiencies were killing pilots at unsustainable rates. The alternative, continuing operations with vulnerable aircraft, meant accepting ongoing attrition that was equally unsustainable but distributed across time rather than concentrated during production transitions. Japanese military leadership chose to continue operations with existing designs, attempting to compensate for survivability deficiencies through tactical adjustments and pilot training emphasis on avoiding hits entirely. This choice, while perhaps unavoidable given strategic circumstances and material constraints, meant that Japanese pilots continued dying in circumstances where better protected aircraft might have saved them. Every pilot killed in a situation where armor plate would have stopped fatal rounds, every pilot burned to death in fires that self-sealing tanks might have prevented, every pilot who died in structural failures that robust construction might have survived, represented the human cost of design philosophy decisions. By late 1944, Japanese fighter units faced pilot quality degradation so severe that combat effectiveness collapsed across entire operational theaters. Although the Ki-84 could match Allied fighter performance when flown by skilled pilots who understood how to exploit its capabilities, growing difficulties in securing skilled pilots, proper fuel, construction materials, and adequate manufacture often prevented the aircraft from reaching its full potential in the field. Nakajima Ki-84 Wikipedia. The human capital that Japanese air forces had expended through 3 years of attritional combat could not be recovered or replaced within the time remaining before Japan's final defeat. The collision between Japanese and American fighter design philosophies during World War II provides enduring lessons about the relationship between engineering decisions, tactical effectiveness, and strategic outcomes. The story of how Japanese pilots discovered that P-40 aircraft could absorb punishment far exceeding what Japanese designs could survive illustrates how foundational assumptions about acceptable trade-offs can prove decisive in ways that transcend narrow performance metrics. Japanese aircraft designers had made rational calculations based on their material constraints, tactical requirements, and cultural values. They prioritized performance characteristics, maneuverability, range, climb rate, that they judged most important for air combat effectiveness. They accepted reduced survivability as a necessary trade-off for achieving superior performance within severe weight and material limitations. Within the framework of their assumptions and constraints, these decisions made logical sense. American aircraft designers operated under different constraints and made different calculations. They possessed material abundance that allowed heavier construction without prohibitive resource costs. They valued pilot survivability highly enough to accept substantial performance penalties in exchange for protective features. They designed aircraft assuming pilots would be hit and needed margins of survivability to continue operations. Within their framework of assumptions and resources, these decisions also made logical sense. Combat experience demonstrated that American assumptions and design choices proved more strategically sound than Japanese approaches, not because American engineers possessed superior technical knowledge or analytical capability, but because the specific circumstances of sustained air combat in World War II rewarded survivability more highly than the performance advantages Japanese designs achieved through weight minimization. The P-40 Warhawk itself, despite being considered somewhat obsolescent compared to later American fighter designs, compiled an impressive combat record precisely because its survivability features kept pilots alive long enough to gain experience and continue contributing to combat operations. Over 200 Allied fighter pilots from the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, the US, and the Soviet Union became aces flying the P-40, including at least 20 double aces, mostly over North Africa, China, Burma and India, the Southwest Pacific and Eastern Europe. Curtis P-40 Warhawk, Wikipedia. These achievement statistics reflect not just individual pilot skill but the cumulative effect of flying aircraft that brought pilots home alive even after sustaining damage that would have killed pilots in less protected fighters. Each ace who survived being shot down early in his career went on to achieve victories that would not have been possible had his first serious combat damage proven fatal. The multiplication effect of survivability advantages accumulated across thousands of individual pilot careers and tens of thousands of combat engagements. The broader lesson extends beyond World War II fighter aircraft design into contemporary questions about system design trade-offs. The Japanese experience demonstrates that optimizing for narrow performance metrics while neglecting survivability can produce systems that appear superior in direct comparisons but prove less effective in sustained operational employment. The American experience demonstrates that accepting performance compromises in exchange for survivability features can yield strategic advantages that overwhelm the tactical disadvantages those features impose. Modern military aircraft design continues grappling with these fundamental trade-offs. Stealth characteristics impose weight and complexity costs. Armor protection and redundant systems reduce speed and agility. Survivability features complicate maintenance and reduce operational availability. Yet the lessons from World War II suggest that these costs often prove worthwhile investments when measured against the alternative of losing trained operators and expensive platforms to damage that protective features might have prevented. The story that began with Japanese bomber crews over Kunming on December 20, 1941, encountering American fighters that refused to die when hit, ultimately encompassed fundamental questions about engineering philosophy, cultural values, resource allocation, and the nature of sustained combat operations. Japanese pilots' discovery that P-40 aircraft possessed survivability advantages their own fighters lacked represented more than tactical revelation. It represented confrontation with the consequences of design decisions made years earlier, decisions that could not be reversed or compensated for within the time frame that remained before Japan's strategic defeat. The P-40 Warhawk, dismissed by some historians as mediocre design suitable only for ground attack, proved its worth precisely where it mattered most, keeping pilots alive through sustained combat operations. The armor plate that added weight and reduced performance saved lives. The self-sealing fuel tanks that decreased range prevented fires. The robust construction that compromised agility maintained control authority after damage. These features, dismissed or omitted by Japanese designers pursuing different priorities, proved strategically decisive in ways that pure performance comparisons could never capture. As we reflect on the story of Japanese pilots' education and American aircraft survivability, we confront uncomfortable truths about how foundational assumptions shape outcomes in ways that only become apparent through harsh experience. The Japanese pilots who survived the war carried with them knowledge purchased at terrible cost, that superior maneuverability could not compensate for fundamental vulnerability, that pilot skill alone could not overcome probability across extended operations, and that design philosophy decisions made in peacetime engineering offices would determine who lived and who died in combat years later. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.